Imagine you wake up one morning and discover that everything you built, your home, your business, your dreams, has been washed away overnight. Not because of your mistakes, not because of your choices, but because of forces far beyond your control. Millions of people in Pakistan lived through this reality when the floods came. And yet, while entire towns drowned, the world remained strangely quiet. No global outrage, no endless headlines, no urgent calls to action, just silence. Now, silence is powerful. Sometimes it is wisdom, but sometimes it is complicity. And when silence surrounds a tragedy of this scale, it makes us ask, what is the world trying to hide? Why is it easier to look away than to confront the truth? Today, I want to take you on a journey, not just about floods in one country, but about how the world decides whose pain matters, whose stories are amplified, and whose suffering is quietly erased. Because if we don't ask these questions today, tomorrow it may be another nation, another people facing disaster while the world scrolls past. Stay with me until the end, because this is not only about Pakistan. It is about justice, about responsibility, and about the kind of humanity we want to build together. If we can uncover what lies behind this silence, we will uncover not only hidden truths, but also hidden opportunities. Opportunities to build a world that is fairer, stronger, and more united. So let us begin. The first reality we must face is the way media decides what deserves global attention and what quietly fades into silence. When the floods struck Pakistan, entire towns were submerged, millions were displaced, and lives were turned upside down in ways most of the world cannot even imagine. Yet, if we look at the international media landscape, the coverage was faint, short-lived, and quickly overshadowed by less catastrophic events elsewhere. The question arises, why does a disaster of such massive scale receive so little visibility compared to tragedies in Europe or North America? It is not just about journalism. It is about the politics of narrative, about who gets to be heard and who is left voiceless. Disasters are not equal in the eyes of the media. When a flood hits a developed country, it becomes a breaking story, repeated for weeks, accompanied by human interest features, celebrity fundraisers, and political discussions. But when millions in Pakistan lose their homes, the narrative is often reduced to a few images and a passing mention. This silence is not accidental, it is constructed. The global media operates within frameworks influenced by economic interests, audience expectations, and geopolitical priorities. Pakistan, unfortunately, does not sit at the center of those interests. This selective storytelling reinforces a hierarchy of human suffering, where some lives are treated as more newsworthy than others. Such disproportionate coverage also shapes international response. Governments act when their citizens demand action, and citizens demand action when media keeps an issue alive. By minimizing Pakistan's floods in their coverage, global media effectively reduce the pressure on powerful states to extend meaningful aid or push for systemic change in climate policy. Silence translates into slower relief efforts, less attention from financial institutions, and minimal urgency in addressing long-term vulnerabilities. Another layer is the narrative of resilience often attached to nations like Pakistan. The world has grown accustomed to seeing South Asian countries battling floods, earthquakes, or heat waves. As a result, disasters here are sometimes presented as routine, almost expected, and therefore less shocking. This desensitization allows the global community to look away without guilt. But what is hidden behind this silence is not just a disaster. It is a question of justice. It is the erasure of human dignity on a mass scale, the quiet acceptance that some nations can drown in silence while the world keeps scrolling. When we look at the silence surrounding Pakistan's floods, it cannot be separated from the larger web of economic and strategic interests that shape international behavior. Acknowledging the scale of destruction would mean accepting responsibility, not only in the moral sense, but also in financial terms. For many powerful nations and global institutions, this acknowledgement would create pressure to provide billions in aid, to restructure debt burdens, or to grant concessions that they are not prepared to offer. Instead of highlighting the devastation, the crisis is allowed to fade from headlines, making it easier for the world to avoid this difficult obligation. International financial systems operate in ways that are often indifferent to humanitarian emergencies. Pakistan is a country already facing significant economic challenges, and the floods compounded those vulnerabilities. If the disaster were given sustained global coverage, it would build momentum for debt relief or emergency financial restructuring, but that would cut into the profits and influence of lenders who prefer to keep countries trapped in cycles of repayment. Silence, therefore, becomes a tool of convenience, keeping public pressure low and allowing business as usual to continue. Strategic interests play an equally powerful role. Global powers calculate every move in terms of influence, alliances, and long-term positioning. Pakistan, due to its location and its ties with different blocs, is a country that does not fully align with any single power. This ambiguity often leads to selective engagement. For some nations, highlighting Pakistan's floods and rushing with meaningful assistance might empower a state they view with suspicion or rivalry. For others, keeping the crisis in the shadows maintains Pakistan's dependence on external financial systems and aid negotiations. Geopolitics, therefore, is not just about military or trade. It extends to how much empathy a nation is allowed to receive on the global stage. The hidden reality is that humanitarian response is often filtered through political convenience. Aid is rarely neutral. It comes with conditions, expectations, or at the very least, the desire for influence. By keeping quiet on Pakistan's floods, global powers avoid a scenario where they must show generosity without extracting something in return. What appears as silence is in fact a calculated decision. It is easier to turn away than to face the moral and financial cost of doing what is right. And in this silence, millions of displaced families are left waiting for justice that may never arrive. The floods in Pakistan were not just the result of heavy rains, they were the outcome of a climate crisis that is disproportionately created by wealthy nations, yet disproportionately suffered by vulnerable ones. When the global conversation remains quiet about Pakistan's disaster, it conceals an uncomfortable truth. Those who contributed least to climate change are paying the highest price, while those most responsible remain shielded from accountability. Major carbon emitters in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia have built their economies on centuries of unchecked industrialization, releasing greenhouse gases that destabilize global weather systems. Yet, when those very emissions fuel floods, droughts, and storms in poorer countries, the link is downplayed or ignored. This silence serves to protect powerful nations from questions they would rather not answer. If Pakistan's tragedy were openly tied to climate injustice, it would strengthen the demand for reparations, loss and damage funds, and climate finance at an unprecedented scale. It would highlight the moral obligation of developed nations to compensate those suffering consequences they did not create. But such obligations come with enormous financial implications, commitments that wealthy states often resist. By keeping the narrative narrow, focusing only on local mismanagement or resilience, the global community avoids acknowledging the deeper systemic causes of the disaster. There is also the risk of climate change being used as a political weapon. Instead of addressing the root problem, some countries frame disasters in vulnerable nations as evidence of instability, inefficiency, or incapacity to govern. This framing is strategic, shifting responsibility away from global emitters and placing blame squarely on the shoulders of the affected nation. In Pakistan's case, this narrative reinforces stereotypes of vulnerability, ensuring that global sympathy does not translate into structural support. The silence hides the fact that what happened in Pakistan is not an isolated event, but part of a global pattern. By avoiding the climate justice debate, the silence also undermines the momentum of collective action. It prevents the global audience from seeing Pakistan's floods as a warning of what could soon become a universal crisis. The silence keeps the problem compartmentalized, treating it as a distant tragedy rather than a shared responsibility. What is hidden here is not only the suffering of millions, but also the uncomfortable reminder that climate change is a global debt. And until it is acknowledged, disasters like Pakistan's floods will continue to expose the unequal foundations of our world. When examining the global silence on Pakistan's floods, it becomes clear that geopolitics plays a powerful role in shaping the narrative. International attention is never distributed equally. It is filtered through the lens of power, alliances, and strategic gain. For many influential states, highlighting Pakistan's crisis would elevate its visibility on the global stage, potentially strengthening its bargaining power in critical areas such as climate finance, trade negotiations, and regional diplomacy. By muting the scale of the disaster, Pakistan is kept in a weaker negotiating position, forced to approach international institutions and donor states from a place of dependency rather than partnership. This deliberate lack of emphasis ensures that Pakistan remains constrained when seeking justice in platforms like the United Nations or climate summits. When a disaster becomes a headline in the Western world, it often builds momentum that cannot be ignored. Governments are pushed to act, institutions are pressured to release funds, and alliances are reconsidered. In contrast, when Pakistan's tragedy is overshadowed, the urgency disappears, and its demands for fair treatments in climate financing or debt relief lose weight. The silence is not just absence of coverage. It is a form of quiet control, a way of managing how much influence a vulnerable nation can exert on the international stage. Geopolitical calculations also reflect rivalries. Pakistan occupies a sensitive geographic position connecting South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Its alliances are fluid, often balancing between different powers, which makes it difficult for any one bloc to see strategic advantage in amplifying its struggles. For some, downplaying Pakistan's plight avoids strengthening a partner of China's Belt and Road Initiative. For others, it avoids fueling sympathy that might shift regional dynamics in South Asia. These subtle considerations result in a silence that is not accidental but deliberate, carefully measured to keep Pakistan's leverage limited. This muted response also aligns with a broader pattern in global politics. Humanitarian crises are rarely separated from power politics. Aid and attention are selectively mobilized, not purely on the basis of human suffering, but on whether the suffering serves a strategic purpose. In Pakistan's case, the disaster exposed millions to unimaginable hardship, yet the global stage remained relatively quiet because amplifying the story offered little return to powerful actors. Hidden within the silence is an uncomfortable truth. When empathy collides with geopolitics, strategy often wins, and those in greatest need are left struggling for a voice. The global response to Pakistan's floods revealed a stark reality. Humanitarian aid is not guided solely by compassion, but by politics and selective empathy. When a disaster strikes certain regions, we witness an immediate outpouring of solidarity. Relief funds are announced overnight. Leaders make emotional statements. Media outlets run continuous coverage, and international organizations mobilize resources without delay. Yet when Pakistan faced one of the worst climate catastrophes in its history, the urgency was missing. Assistance trickled in slowly, often tied to conditions, and the overall response fell far short of the scale of human suffering. This disparity forces us to ask why some lives are treated as more urgent, more worthy of protection than others. The silence surrounding Pakistan's floods exposes the double standards in how the world values human dignity. In wealthier countries, disasters are framed as shared global tragedies, deserving of collective support. In poor nations, they are often depicted as unfortunate but expected, as though suffering is an unavoidable part of life in these regions. This mindset justifies a slower and smaller response, allowing governments and institutions to claim they have helped while doing far less than what the situation demands. Such selective empathy normalizes inequality on a global scale. Another hidden layer lies in how aid is distributed. Instead of unconditional support, much of the help Pakistan received came with bureaucratic hurdles, delayed disbursements, and political strings attached. Relief was often presented not as a duty owed to victims of climate injustice, but as charity reinforcing dependency rather than empowerment. This approach reflects a deeper problem. Humanitarian response is too often an instrument of influence rather than a neutral act of solidarity. By keeping assistance limited and controlled, powerful nations maintain leverage over vulnerable ones. The double standard also weakens global trust. When people in Pakistan see the disparity between the swift billions sent to other regions and the hesitant trickle that reached them, it fuels resentment and skepticism about the fairness of international systems. It raises the question of whether global solidarity is truly universal or simply a privilege extended to a select few. What remains hidden in this silence is the uncomfortable recognition that humanitarianism is not equally applied. The floods in Pakistan were not just a natural disaster, but a test of global conscience. And the muted response revealed how selective the world has become in choosing whose suffering truly matters. Breaking the silence on Pakistan's floods is not only a matter of empathy. It is about demanding global accountability in the face of a shared crisis. The floods were not an isolated tragedy confined to one nation. They are a reminder of the growing vulnerabilities created by climate change, economic injustice, and political neglect. When the world chooses to stay quiet, it avoids confronting the deeper responsibilities that powerful nations, financial institutions, and international organizations carry. Accountability means admitting that climate disasters are not accidents of geography, but consequences of decades of industrial policies and economic exploitation that have enriched a few while exposing billions to risk. For Pakistan, accountability is not just about emergency aid. It is about fair access to climate financing, genuine debt relief, and structural reforms that allow vulnerable countries to rebuild without falling into deeper dependence. If the silence continues, the same cycle will repeat. Disasters will strike, global attention will briefly flicker, and then victims will be left to struggle with inadequate resources. By keeping the spotlight dim, those responsible for larger systemic problems can escape without making meaningful changes. True accountability would force nations with the largest carbon footprints to contribute proportionately to loss and damage funds, to recognize climate justice as a binding principle rather than a charitable gesture. Global accountability also extends to institutions that manage financial and humanitarian responses. Multilateral banks, aid agencies, and global bodies often operate with bureaucratic delays and conditions that dilute the effectiveness of their support. Breaking the silence means exposing these inefficiencies and demanding reforms that prioritize people over paperwork, survival over politics. Pakistan's floods should have triggered a broader discussion on reforming global systems that repeatedly failed the most vulnerable. Instead, the lack of visibility allowed those systemic flaws to remain hidden and unchallenged. But accountability is not only external, it is also collective. Every disaster in one part of the world is a signal to all humanity. If Pakistan's tragedy is ignored, then tomorrow another vulnerable nation will face the same silence. By breaking this pattern, the world would acknowledge that climate change and humanitarian crises know no borders. Silence hides responsibility, but speaking out forces accountability. What happened in Pakistan is a warning, and responding to it with justice rather than neglect is the only way to build a fairer, more secure global future. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reflect on this silence surrounding Pakistan's floods, we must recognize that what is hidden here is bigger than a single nation's tragedy. It is about the unequal weight of human lives in global narratives, the quiet protection of financial interests, the evasion of climate responsibility, the manipulations of geopolitics, the double standards of humanitarianism, and the absence of accountability where it matters most. This silence is not simply the absence of words, it is the presence of choices. Choices that shape who is heard, who is helped, and who is left to drown in neglect. But silence does not erase truth. The suffering of millions cannot be hidden forever. Each flood, each storm, each rising wave is a reminder that we are all connected in this crisis. Breaking the silence is not just an act of solidarity with Pakistan. It is a step toward justice for every vulnerable nation that will face the same fate tomorrow. If the world continued to hide behind silence, it will one day discover that no wall, no border, and no economy can shield it from the consequences of neglect. So I leave you with this. Let us not be silent spectators. Let us be the voice that demands fairness, the hands that extend real support, and the conscience that refuses to ignore suffering. Because in the end, history will not remember the floods alone. It will remember whether the world chose to stay silent or chose to act. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And I wish you all the courage to stand for truth, for justice, and for humanity. Good luck, and thank you.